Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Charmaine Crockett. I'm the Director of Stakeholder Engagement for CanWaCH. And on behalf of Helen Scott, our Chief Executive Officer, Julia Anderson, our Chief Operating Officer, and the entire CanWaCH team, I would like to thank you for joining us today. Every 2 years since 2015, CanWaCH has been conducting public opinion research on behalf of our membership, and we are very pleased today to share the findings of our 2019 research with our members and sector partners. We use the results of this polling to gain insights into Canadians' awareness and views on Canada's investment in programming in global women and children's health, and on our members' work and achievements. We leverage it to assess our strengths and weaknesses in engaging Canadians and to capture insights into new opportunities on where and how to best engage them on these issues. The findings inform the work of our members and partners across many areas of the business beyond public engagement, including policy development, member and sector collaboration, stakeholder relations, and much more. Timing-wise for CanWaCH, this is an important piece of evidence around Canadians' views as we approach the federal election just days from now. We have the opportunity to use some of this information on what we know about Canadians to shape thinking and inform conversations throughout that campaign. For 2019, we commissioned Nanos Research, and we are joined today by Nick Nanos, Chief Data Scientist and founder of Nanos Research. In a moment, Nick is going to walk you through highlights of the results and impart his insights. In addition to Nick and the Nanos team, we would like to thank those who've contributed to this project, including members of the CanWaCH Public Engagement Working Group, many whom have joined us here today. I would also like to thank Spencer Henson, our Public Engagement Working Group member from the University of Guelph, for his additional support in the development of this year's survey. As a participant in this webinar, we will be providing you with a link to an advanced copy of the report. We ask that you and your colleagues do not share any of this information outside your organizations pending our official launch, which it will be probably this week or early next week. We'll send a notice on the Eventbrite event that we have set up for this webinar to let you know when that happens. There will be a press release and we'll let you know. We're just waiting for a final version of our French report. A few notes about today's session. We will hold all questions until after Nick's presentation. You may unmute yourself and ask your questions at that time, or you may submit questions in writing using the chat feature in your Zoom screen. It's on the bottom sort of right of the share button. You can ask your questions in there. And you can also, if you have any technical issues, you're having trouble seeing or hearing, you can also use the chat feature to advise us. And my colleague, Caitlin Reed, is here and can maybe offer to support you on that. Hopefully we have no technical issues. Without any further ado, I will hand things over to Nick.
Super. So let me share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
I think it's just coming up now for me. We can see it, Nick.
Super. So anyways, thanks everyone for joining the call today, and I'm really excited to walk through the findings of this research. Like Charmaine was saying, the timing is very good in terms of the upcoming federal election. Actually, the moment is good, especially when you look at some of the longitudinal tracking on Canadians on these very important issues. And I'm very happy to do a walkthrough on this and to kind of support your efforts in putting this on the radar for Canadians and to advance kind of a positive dialogue on moving forward. Couple things. So first of all, if you might wonder what the order is for the research in terms of the content itself, I'd always kind of say, and I said this on a previous call, that asking a researcher to justify the order of the content is like choosing between your children. They're all very important, but you might have to kind of sequence things depending on what you're looking at right now. So there's no when we look at the order, if something's last, that doesn't mean that it's the least important. And if something is first, it doesn't mean that it's the most important. But what we wanted to do was to share a story with you today, and a narrative related to where Canadians are on Canada's role in global development, and specifically aid to women and children's and health issues. And as Charmaine was saying, I'm looking forward to the questions and the discussion at the very end. Before I get into the data itself, and all of these details related to the methodology are articulated in the full report in much more detail. But the key thing to take away is that this was a hybrid survey, so people were recruited by telephone, land and cell line, and then they did the survey online. We did the survey at the end of June. It was a bilingual survey. The margin of error is plus or minus 2.5 percentage points. And you know, the research that we're about to kind of present right now, at least, gives us a really good snapshot as to where we are. And it's quite interesting, especially when we compare the research to previous waves, because it gives a sense of direction. And I'd like to use the term or phrase positive trajectory, because on a lot of these big important issues, it's very clear that from a public opinion perspective that we're on a positive trajectory and a very positive level of engagement with Canadians when it comes to women's and children's health issues. So, you know, when I look at the research writ large, I see a number of things. First of all, I see that the issue is on the radar for Canadians, and increasingly on the radar, that there's enhanced engagement now compared to the past. I was also struck by what I would consider, what I would call a greater sense of duty, and people being more selfless and a spirit of generosity. And I say this in the context of a lot of the other research that we've done and other individuals and organizations have done in the public domain, that is actually speaks to populism, things that are much more negative, that might put us a focus on people potentially being more selfish as opposed to selfless. But what's very interesting in some of the longitudinal tracking that we've done on your behalf is that on this particular issue, Canadians are actually more likely to want to kind of put their global responsibilities ahead, and of kind of more nativist sentiment. And I think this is actually what I thought was one of the more interesting findings in the research. So like all things in life, the numbers are not all perfect. So there's good news, there's positive trajectory, but there's still things that obviously could be improved upon and require more engagement when we think of the future. We opened up the survey with an open-ended. Unprompted means open-ended, where Canadians could say whatever they wanted. And what we wanted to do was at least have Canadians set the table themselves before we started to put content in front of them, and ask them quite simply what the most important social issue was in Canada, and they could say whatever they wanted, and also what the most important social issue in developing countries were, and Canadians could say whatever they want. One caveat that I'd like to put on the table is that many times these issues reflect what is in or not in the news at the time or around the time of the survey. So when we talk about social issues, people were more likely to kind of unprompted, and you can see about 1 out of every 5 were unprompted likely to cite something related to climate change, the environment, pollution. You can see corruption identified as a challenge, immigration, refugees, poverty, healthcare, indigenous issues. On social issues in developing countries, you can see that you know, basically when we think of the top tier of unprompted issues where Canadians could say whatever they wanted, at the very top of the list was poverty, and then climate change, water, food accessibility, and then other issues like corruption, healthcare, and civil unrest being identified as unprompted issues. When we go into prompted, and this is where we would provide a list and Canadians could select from a list in terms of top global issues to focus aid on for developing countries, you can see that at the top of the list, hunger, food security, climate change, and education were at the top, and then a series of of other issues which were also important, but just didn't necessarily register as high as hunger and food security, things like human rights, poverty, humanitarian aid. You can see that 8% of Canadians said that they should, we should be focusing on domestic issues, but the other way to look at that is more than 90%, or more than 9 out of every 10 Canadians identified, different issues to focus aid on. When it came to top global health issues, you can see water, sanitation, and hygiene was identified by 3 out of every 10 Canadians, followed by food and security at around 17%. And together, those two representing the most popular responses when it came to focus aid on for developing countries. Awareness of global leadership role of Canada regarding women, maternal, and child health. Looking at the trend line, you can see that awareness is, you can see, on the rise. Those net scores, if you might wonder, are the differences between positive and negative scores. And we use these net scores as a bit of a quick crib note to look at the data to see what the draw is, the positive or negative draw of a particular question is. So you can see back in 2015, and this would be at the tail end of the Harper era, you can see that only about 21% of Canadians were aware. Midway through the liberal mandate, it's up to 25. You can see in 2019 that it's up significantly to 43%. That said, one way to look at this is still 46% of Canadians are not aware. Another 11% are unsure, and so there's still room, positive room at least, for better scores on this. So you can see the trajectory is positive, but there's still room for engagement in terms of global leadership role of Canada regarding women, maternal, and child health. On the awareness front, you can see that the awareness was lowest in the province of Quebec, which might speak to some regional variations in the number on this particular issue. But generally, we're about the same in other parts of the country, whether it's Atlantic Canada, Ontario, the Prairies, or British Columbia. No real difference based on gender, and that if you were over 35 years of age, you were more likely to be aware of this issue compared to Canadians that were under 35 years of age. On the engagement front, I was quite struck by the interest and eagerness of Canadians in terms of talking and learning more about Canada taking a leadership role. And this goes to kind of one of my key observations in the data, is that we're at a moment in time. What does this mean? Will it always be like this? We don't know, but it is positive right now. And it speaks to the important juncture in terms of the positive trajectory of the numbers, people's interest in being engaged, and their appetite for Canada to take a leadership role. So when we look at this positive trajectory, we shouldn't think that it's going to be positive forever, because it may or may not be. But what we do know based on the research is that we're at a particular positive moment in time in terms of greater awareness and also engagement. And you can see when we kind of tried to map out or looked at mapping out communication on social issues, it's quite striking that you can see that within the past week, 84% of Canadians at least reported having read, watched, or listened to a story. So I see this as a bit of a hierarchy of activities on social issues. And at the top of that hierarchy is seeing something in the news related to a social issue. Also high up on the hierarchy of activities, talking to friends, family, and coworkers, looking at items online. And beyond that, you can see still a pretty decent level of activity, but when you get to sharing, commenting, writing about something online, or even sharing, signing a petition, you can see that the the level of intensity and frequency of those are just not as strong. And one of the ways to look at this is, with the vast majority of Canadians reading, talking, and looking at items related to social issues, the big question is, how do you convert that interest and appetite into action? And I would look at what I would say the bottom four on social issues as something to you would want to monitor and track over time, and identify some of those as activities and asks that you would like to motivate Canadians who are already currently engaged on a social issue or problem as something that they take an interest in. Social media and social networking sites they visited in the last week. Not a big surprise. At the top of the food chain is Facebook and YouTube. 70% of the Canadians that we surveyed had visited Facebook in the past week, and more than half had visited YouTube. And you can see those two as the top tier. Second tier being Google, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, and Pinterest. And then what I'll say, blogs, Reddit, Snapchat, Tumblr, and other. There are some demographic variations, like the Snapchat numbers and the Pinterest numbers for Canadians under 35 years of age are a little higher. But I look at this, and you should consider this particular page as, what is the best way to reach the greatest number of Canadians? So think of it this way: as we start to build the layers of the data insights that we've kind of captured through the study we've done on your behalf, people are interested and engaged. They're increasingly aware. These are the main kind of channels to which to have the broadest reach. And this should help inform kind of some of your communications tactics and priorities, at least, if you wanted to kind of further engage and kind of elevate the level of conversation when it comes to your issue. Source of international news: television. You can see still at 37%, and that might seem high, but just to probably put this into context, for other studies that we've done for other clients, this number probably would have been in the 70s 5 or 6 years ago, with the internet probably being in between 10 to 20 to 25%. So you have to kind of think of the twin pillars as television and internet websites of news organizations as the kind of top two drivers, at least, when it comes to sources of news for things that are happening outside of Canada. The other thing that's quite important, and I share this as someone that deals with news organizations all the time, getting on television is harder now, and still very difficult, especially national news items, compared to some of the kind of what I'll say the news channels, which have need content to fill. But internet websites of news organizations, I find increasingly they're usually the space, and they have a lot more bandwidth. The news organizations have more bandwidth for content there. So, one of the things to think about is, how you want to reach those people. The other thing is that, when you look at the television numbers, not a big surprise, you can see a significant variance when it comes to age. Less than 1 out of every 5 Canadians under 35 years of age use television as a source for what's happening outside of Canada. Those numbers are, for all intents and purposes, almost inverted when it comes to television and internet websites, where younger people are more likely to tap into internet websites for news on what's going on outside of Canada. So this kind of gives you an idea of kind of news kind of channels and to connect with Canadians. The other thing that's interesting is when we ask on engagement, so we talked about awareness, appetite, interest, where they go for information. On the, I'll call it the activist front, you can see, especially when you compare 2019 to 2017, for all intents and purposes, a positive increase in activities. I think this is part of the moment in time. And what we've seen at least is that these particular numbers for these types of activities actually fluctuate. They're not straight line calculations over time. That when people are more engaged in issues and they feel that they can have an impact, they tend to be more involved. If they don't feel that they can have an impact and there are no kind of aspirational messages to kind of coalesce around, that they become less involved. So you have to think of these activities kind of like voter turnout, right? Voter turnout is not a straight line calculation that incrementally increases over time. There have been higher voter turnouts in elections 100 years ago, in the free trade election and so forth. And the voter turnout fluctuates based on the current environment. And this goes back to kind of what I'll say my hypothesis related to a moment in time, that not only are people more likely to be aware, not only are they more likely to be engaged, but activism at this particular moment in time is higher. The other thing is that many of these kind of activist activities are generationally based, which is quite important. So could it be a straight line trajectory? Possibly, but I would like to think, at least, or based on the historical trend line, these things move up and down depending on how engaged and positive people think, or think whether they can make a difference or not. So this speaks to the importance of kind of the moment that we're in. When it comes to international development activism, you can see that donating to a cause or a charity at the top of the list, but there's a significant drop in terms of volunteerism or participating in terms of international development in a faith-based group. And not as many people you can see are writing to politicians. The interesting thing about this is I think Twitter has probably supplanted writing letters. 10 or 20 years ago, people actually wrote letters to their politicians. Now they just kind of vent on Twitter as opposed to sending a letter. But the other interesting thing is that right now, 52%, so half, say they are not engaged at all. And this would, as opposed to just looking at the numbers in terms of what they've said that they've done, I think one of the things would be to look at the people that have not engaged in any of the activities and to say, how can that number potentially be lowered over time? And remember, previously I talked about more than 8 out of every 10 and 3 out of every 4 Canadians either reading stuff online about social issues and also talking to their friends about these types of issues. So you have to think of converting that interest in social activism and so forth into actual activity and action. Responses on what things might do on a news story about Canada taking a leadership role in improving the lives of women and children in the world's poorest countries. Interesting thing, and this is where the net scores really tell a story. Talking to friends and learning more. And this learning component, I think, is probably a key takeaway from the study, that it's every opportunity that you have to engage Canadians, you don't only want to have them engage in a conversation, and that's very important. What you want to do is hopefully make that also a learning and engagement opportunity, because you can see that basically 7 out of every 10 Canadians said they're very likely or somewhat likely to want to learn more about something if they saw a news story. The other upside is that although they're divided, because the net score is only +1, about 46% of Canadians are very likely or somewhat likely to like the story. But then you can see publicly commenting or sharing the story on social media does not have the same amount of traction as other types of activities. So my key takeaway here is these news stories about Canada taking a leadership role are initiators for discussion and dialogue, but also initiators as opportunities for education. On the duty front, you know, it's quite interesting, the intensity of feelings. And when I speak to intensity, it'll be much clearer, but you know, people are moving a little more from being mushy on this to have more firm opinions in related to the world's poorest and most marginalized people. And you know, my point here on this is connecting urgency to action is going to be critical. And I usually put it in this particular context. So everybody has a lot of priorities. People themselves, Canadians, worry about whether they have a job, whether their son or daughter has a job, whether their mother or daughter can get their hip replaced and access healthcare. They're worried about things that happen in their community. They identify kind of issues related to the poor and marginalized around the world as important. But the critical thing is to create a sense of urgency so that this doesn't get delayed. And I'd usually say this in the context, and I say this without judgment of politicians, and this is not a partisan comment, but politicians many times, if they're being engaged by stakeholders on a particular issue, will tell the stakeholder, I support what you do. What you do is very important. I agree that there's a problem. And then but we have other priorities and things that we need to get to. And I think that's probably one of the key messages that at least I have for you based on what I believe we've learned through the study, is that in addition to nailing down the engagement and the importance and the trajectory, you need to add a dimension of urgency so that stakeholders and Canadians feel that they should be acting more. And there's obviously room for improvement. The base is quite good for the work that you do, but there is room for improvement in terms of just having more Canadians become engaged and to kind of act. We tested on a series of statements, and you can get an idea of how much traction each of these individual statements have about Canada's role in global health aid. And I'd always kind of put this in the context of not necessarily, this is not like Survivor Island, where you know you take the bottom number and you drop that statement. I'd always kind of tell clients that you know there could be strategic reasons for you to advance something that might not be as popular, but is the right public policy and the right thing to do. But this gives you an idea, at least of among Canadians, if they hear certain things, the things that they are most intensely likely to agree with. And you can see the top two statements, that advancing causes like women and children's health, Health Canada's reputation, and also the government continuing to support and fund programs that improve and enhance sexual and reproductive health and rights, including safe access to abortion for women and girls in developing countries. Those two being the key drivers. And you know, the other thing is I talk about intensity. You can see the level of intensity on the sexual and reproductive health and rights. The level of intensity there is actually the strongest at 45%. But even when you look at the people that agree and somewhat agree, you know, the score is still quite strong, because for all intents and purposes, it's basically almost 8 out of every 10 Canadians. The other two statements still perform well. And when I put this in context, I have clients that would kill to have your worst score on some things. So you should not be disappointed that only 58% of Canadians say that should focus on women's within Canada's own poor communities. But there's going to be some other numbers there that are kind of going to be interesting to kind of put that into a greater context. On the sexual and reproductive health and rights, you know, you can see for all intents and purposes, not quite a consensus, but almost a consensus opinion, with only about 18% of Canadians disagreeing to one extent or another. But this has a significant amount of traction across the board, and also more likely to have traction, you can see, among women compared to men. On another series of statements related to aid, you can see the assertion or the statement that when developing countries are stable, we all benefit, has a significant amount of traction. You know, you can see up to 9 out of every 10 Canadians agree, strongly agree, or somewhat agree with that. And, you know, for all intents and purposes, a very comfortable majority of Canadians agree with all of the statements. And you know, so all of these, for all intents and purposes, positive statements could be a bit of a mix and match in terms of saying that Canada needs to do its fair share, that we have a duty or a moral obligation. The other thing is that, you know, when we look at the statement with the lowest score, even in the context of everything else, the lowest score had to do with more of a nativist view that we need to help people more at home. So I thought that was quite interesting. On more kind of statement testing, the whole idea that that aid is wasted. You can see that only about 43% of Canadians agree with that. The other thing is Canada falling behind other countries in the aid it gives to developing countries had the greatest level of unsure at 28%. This speaks to kind of the importance of the education component of what you're doing. But many times we see more of a mixed bag of opinion when people actually need more information. And it would be kind of, these would be different kind of statements that if you were to embark on these statements, there would need to be more proof points in the dialogue in order for people to be more likely to agree with positions that are favorable to you. But you know, you can see that the fair share argument basically, for all intents and purposes, is very well received. You know, both among men and women and across all of the demographics. It's a little lower in the prairies than other provinces in parts of the country, but the reality is that even the lowest score is still 3 out of every 4 Canadians strongly agreeing or somewhat agreeing with what I'll say the fair share argument. On the duty front, when we look at the longitudinal tracking, and this speaks to kind of what I'll say the moment in time and the positive trajectory, that the proportion of Canadians that strongly agree has actually doubled in the last 2 years, and that there's been a noticeable improvement in the numbers on agreement, especially comparing the numbers in 2015 to 2017. And you know, on the duty front, you can see that women are more likely to kind of agree with the duty argument compared to men, and also Canadians that are over 55 years of age are more likely to agree with that particular observation. You know, I'd always kind of, whenever I look at the different age demographics, I always kind of look at people that are 55 years of age and greater as people that have more life experience. People 35 to 54 more likely to be focused on kind of their current situation because they're usually sandwiched between parents and children. And 18 to 34 at the beginning and a little more kind of aspirational. They might be a little more unsure, but I think this speaks to the fact that when you look at the numbers, they're still actually quite positive. And same thing on the moral obligation front. Women more likely than men to kind of have that message resonate, but still among men, it's 2 out of every 3. And you know, very similar numbers on the demographic front when it comes to whether you're young or old. The perception that we have a moral obligation to help people living in developing countries is actually quite quite strong. When we kind of shift over to the benefits side of the ledger, this goes back to, all of these things are important, but you can get a better sense, at least from a communications and public engagement point of view, what's likely to have the greatest resonance. Stability and peace in the world being a significant driver. You can see 9 out of every 10 Canadians say it's very important or somewhat important. All of these score quite well, but things like reducing the threat of terrorism and tackling climate change being significant drivers. And you can get an idea at least of what types of messages that you could potentially lead with in order to capture the attention and engagement and support of Canadians when it comes to the benefits of the aid Canada gives to developing countries. On the nativist front, and as a junkie observer of societal trends, not just in Canada, but in other countries, I thought this was among the more interesting and striking findings of the study. You can see that, you look at the trend line, it's actually more interesting. This is the trend line on the nativist, front. So think back in 2015, 20% of Canadians disagreed with the focusing on home. Now it's up to, you can see, almost 4 out of every 10 Canadians disagreeing, and there being, I consider that a significant change in terms of the proportion of Canadians that disagree that we should be focusing on Canada's own poor. It doesn't mean that they're not important, but I think when we look at the trend on this, it's actually quite interesting, and this speaks to kind of more of the perspective of people understanding the whole idea of their interest in these types of stories, their engagement, and the importance that they see that this type of work has globally, and the benefits that really accrue to everyone. This is a bit of a breakdown in terms of what I'll say the nativist sentiment, and you can see that it's highest in the prairies. So if you happen to live in the prairie provinces, you're more likely to agree that we should be focusing on Canada's own poor compared to others. If you happen to be 35 to 54, and these are the Canadians that are kind of sandwiched, as I said, between parents and children, you're also marginally more likely to agree. But the longer term trend on this is, I thought, actually more significant than a lot of other things. Global citizen, this is a tough question, but you can see 7% of Canadians outright consider themselves a global citizen. And another 22% somewhat agree that they would characterize themselves as a global citizen. I'm not sure as something to lead with from a communications and engagement point of view that this is actually a strong point. What the polling suggests is that if we engage and want Canadians to engage in development and support of women and children in poor and marginalized developing countries, it has to be not because they think they're some kind of global citizen, but because they believe that we have a moral obligation and that there's a benefit to doing this, that it's the right thing to do, and that they want to make a difference. Trying to connect this to this whole idea of being a global citizen, I don't think has as much traction. And if you use those types of words, you have to remember that 2 out of 3 Canadians will not identify with being a global citizen. And if I talked about trying to get more and more people engaged on the issue and to have a call of action to get more people to act on the issue, this is not the way to do this. So I think that's strategically an important thing to remember as you're kind of engaging Canadians and talking about why. It just basically has to do with the meat and potatoes of it's the right thing to do and it's good for Canada. On the what I'll call the spirit of generosity, you can see that, you know, Canadians are 3 times more likely to want to see an increase than a decrease. And we always look at these net scores because many people are soft on these. But impact, and this isn't a surprise, this is true in very many sectors, but impact is more important, and confidence in having an impact. And you know, if I can put this into context, you know, many times people support a particular policy, but they don't believe that we can have an impact. So one of the things that's actually going to be critical, at least, is to make sure that you can convey what the real and practical impact is of the work that you do. This was the skill testing question, which is always hard. You know, we ask Canadians for every dollar that we spend in total, how much they think is spent on development aid outside of Canada. And you know, the mean, which is the average, so 16.8 cents on the dollar. The median, which is the midpoint, 5 cents. When the mean and median are that different, it speaks to there's a diversity of views. You know, I think that speaks to the fact that I think for average Canadians, regardless of how well or well informed or not well informed that they are, that it's hard for them to put into context how much of our resources are actually going into developing aid. How we think it should change, you can see this is the first of 2 slides. The key takeaway here is that there's a lot of mushy opinion. You know, when we look at the reduce significantly and increase significantly, that's only 27% of the population. So I'd always kind of look at the mushy as those that you need to graduate. And, you know, you can see 13% are unsure, another 21% are say keep the same. Those would be the people that more likely you want to kind of convert into a somewhat increase. But this is the number that I was talking about in terms of the forward look, in terms of the change. And you can see only 16% of Canadians say that they would want to somewhat reduce or reduce significantly the amount that Canada spends on health-related development aid to developing countries, while you can see 50% want to see it increase it. So you can see that by a margin of 3 to 1. You know, the numbers for the increase, Quebec was a bit of an outlier on this in terms of greater appetite for increasing aid on health-related development. But this would be one of the other key findings of the study in terms of the appetite to increase spending related to development aid, health development aid in countries. On the waste front, sorry about that. Similar to some of the other numbers, there's a bit of mushiness here. There's not a lot of firm opinion as to whether it's wasted or not. So that's actually good, because that means that there's room for improvement. It just means that people are just generally don't have super firm opinions. This also means that for those naysayers that say that it is wasted, the reality is only 17% of Canadians agree with them. That said, this is another item, you know, in the broader picture that you would hypothetically or realistically want to drive positive numbers on. Canada is falling behind. On this particular question, actually, you can see there's a significant level of much more significant uptick in the proportion of Canadians that are unsure. I think there's probably a sense that, and just remember 2015 and the government that we had then, 2019 and the government that we had now, that people are less likely to agree that we're falling behind aid. But you know, you can see that there's still a significant level of room for improvement on that. And you know, when we look at this, there aren't really any significant demographic, what I'll say, variances on whether we're falling falling behind or not. Pride in Canada's leadership, reasonably consistent numbers. You know, about on any given wave, you can see about 4 out of every 10 Canadians say that it has no impact, but that the reality is it's still a majority of people that say that they are either much more proud or somewhat more proud when they think about Canada's leadership in global health. So I know we're supposed to finish at 12 o'clock, and I wanted to have time to have questions, a discussion, your reaction, all that kind of stuff. I believe my colleague Alexandra is on the call and hypothetically has all of the data tables in front of her in case we get a very specific question that might be asked. So if I could...
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. That's fantastic. Really much appreciated. As I said, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions. Oh, I see someone already has their hand raised. Sarah, I'll go to you in a sec. But if you are too shy, if you're a shy person, you can also use the chat feature to ask your questions, and we can relay that. But I will turn it over to Sarah for her question.
Thank you, Charmaine, and thanks for CanWaCH for commissioning this. This is so exciting for our sector, and especially to see the change over time in a positive way. And thank you to Nick for that presentation, super in-depth. I apologize if I missed this, but did you do any disaggregation along Canadians' political views beyond geography and age? It'd be interesting to know cross questions.
Yes. No. How's that for an answer?
Thank you.
We have a question from Raul from Horizons of Friendship. Is there any research on where the sense of duty responsibility is coming from for Canadians? Was it formed in educational settings, schools? Is it life experience as hinted at given the higher percentage of 55 plus who identify with this? Is it social media? Would be good to know in order to reinforce this messaging of social justice to lead conversations. And the reason I'm reading this is that not everybody has their video on. So
right.
Yeah.
So we did not ask that question specifically, but if I could make a broader high level comment that when a government, any government, doesn't matter what its partisan stripes are, but whenever any government says that something is important, there's an increasing number of Canadians that tune into that. And that's why I talk about the moment in time. If there was a different government with different priorities and they said other things are important, I won't say what they are, but other things are important, that would have an impact on the broader environment. And you know, even though people don't necessarily agree with all the governments, if whoever the Prime Minister of the day says global aid on women's issues is important, then even for Canadians, regardless of what their personal views might be, they're going to tune in a little more. So we don't have data related to some of the specific drivers, but I do know based on the other research that we've done that when any government identifies something as important for Canada and important for the future of Canada, that it actually has an impact on people's interest in that topic and people wanting to learn more. It doesn't mean that they agree with the government, but it increases the engagement on that.
Wonderful. I thank you very much. I see a question from, it says Ottawa. I'm not sure who that is, but it says, maybe we missed it, but how was the sampling done? Was it random? I think the answer is yes, but you're better to answer the methodology questions than me.
Yes. Okay. So you're ready to geek out? Okay. So we're going to geek out for a second. So we would do a random digit dialing, which means actually it's not like from a list. It's telephone numbers that are randomly generated, and cell phone numbers, landline and cell line numbers that are randomly generated. And then we would have, we would create we do random digit dialing within the sample, and we would have live people, as in we have Nanos has its own call center, calling the random digits. And then those individuals will be invited to do the survey online. So this is not an online survey where you'd see, you know, did you like Jack Layton's mustache? Click here, and you end up doing a survey on CanWaCH. So no one could volunteer. This is a probability sample, and it allows us to give the benefit of rigorous sampling that's random, but also being able to administer it online. And you know, the other thing that's interesting is that, you know, when you look at the composition, there's a significant proportion of people that are actually doing these surveys on their devices, not necessarily at a desktop. So so that's the way it worked, and that's why we can associate a margin of error with this particular study.
Thank you, Nick. I don't see any other questions at the moment on the chat, but please feel free to unmute yourself and just speak up. I just wanted to mention on the political, we did ask for each of the respondents to indicate which political party best reflects their political views. So if anybody has any questions on that political piece, we can follow up later and just get, you know, specifically maybe on a couple of questions, yeah, and look at that analysis after the fact. But we did ask a small piece on the political views.
But we did not ask for people's vote preferences, because that would broach into another category that is not a category that should be.
Yeah, so. Absolutely.
I had one quick question. Did you, does the data divide by or take a look at urban versus rural, or the size of the communities in which Canadians live who are answering these questions?
Yeah, maybe Alexandra, do you have the questionnaire? If you have the questionnaire handy, could you just do a quick walkthrough all of the demographics and profiling questions that we asked? Because when Alexandra does that particular walkthrough, you will be able to see the data, and we have the tabulations based on all of those different dimensions. And I say that hoping that Alexandra is on the call.
I am on the call. So let me just find that section of the questionnaire here. So there is a question on income, on religion, on whether people practice their religion or not, on the federal political party that best reflects their personal views, as well as a question on feelings towards the federal government, which includes a number of possible answers such as anger, optimism, pessimism, satisfaction, and disinterest, as well as an open-ended other option. Actually, no, that was not open-ended, just another option. And then there is the regular stuff like education, length of time lived in Canada if they were not born in Canada, employment status, marital status. There is income, gender, language spoken at home.
Yeah. So.
And postal code, which was actually used to verify that they are in their respective regional location for the survey.
I would like to point out that we did not ask people's vote intention, because that was not done. And when we say feelings towards the government, it was not, it was feeling towards the government of Canada writ large. There's no political lens put on that. And then for the religion question, it's actually, I call it religiosity. So we didn't ask what faith people have, but we asked the frequency, if they did have a faith, the frequency with which they practice their faith. In my experience, the frequency within which people practice their faith is more of an indicator, is a better indicator than having an affinity with a faith group. So, you know, I talked for 50 minutes and I only covered the regular demographics. We could probably go on for the whole afternoon going through a lot of that other stuff. But this is all to say that you've got a big swath of data that you will be able to take a look at and micro target.
Thank you. That's very great clarification. Nick and Alexandra, thank you so much for that. I see we have another message or just a thanks. Does anyone have any other questions? Either just feel free to jump in. I can't see everyone on the screen right now, but so if you have your hand up, apologies. All right. I think we're looking very good. This is great. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you again to the Public Engagement Working Group, who has worked with us on this actually for the second version. We did it in 2017 and 2019. I'm just going to post the link here.
You're on mute, Charmaine.
Sorry about that. You can click on the link that I just posted there immediately for the PDF of the English report. The French is coming. We're just getting everything up. And the tabulations will also be available on our website and I believe on the Nanos Research website as well. We will be doing a public launch. We'll keep you posted on that. We're just waiting a couple of pieces and we will be doing that. And so it's available. It will be available to all either by the end of this week or on Tuesday of next week. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you again, Nick, and all of the team at Nanos Research for this really insightful and great work.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.